Captain Sarah Martinez never imagined her morning flight would become a legendary tale whispered in military circles for decades. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly below her AH-64 Apache helicopter as she conducted routine patrol operations along the Mexican border. At 28, she had already earned respect among her peers as one of the most skilled pilots in the 1st Battalion, 227th Aviation Regiment. Her call sign, Viper, wasn't just because of her deadly accuracy with the Apache's weapon systems, but also her ability to remain calm under the most intense pressure. The morning had started like any other. Sarah completed her pre-flight checklist with meticulous precision, her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Jake Thompson, running through systems checks beside her. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 engines hummed with reliable power as they lifted off from Fort Huachuca at 0600 hours. Their mission seemed straightforward: patrol the southern border corridor and monitor for any suspicious activity that might indicate drug smuggling or illegal border crossings. As they flew at 500 feet above the desert floor, Sarah's trained eyes constantly scanned the horizon. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain, creating a landscape that was both beautiful and potentially dangerous. Her headset crackled with routine radio traffic from base operations and other units in the area. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, despite the serious nature of their patrol mission. However, unknown to Sarah and Jake, their routine flight had been detected by a sophisticated radar system operated by a well-funded drug cartel. This particular criminal organization had invested millions of dollars in military-grade equipment, including surface-to-air missile systems and their own small fleet of modified aircraft. The cartel had been planning a major smuggling operation for months, and the timing of Sarah's patrol couldn't have been worse. Deep in a hidden valley approximately 50 miles from the border, cartel operatives monitored multiple screens showing aircraft movements in the region. When Sarah's Apache appeared on their radar, panic spread through their command center. The drug lords had been expecting a clear sky for their operation, which involved moving several tons of cocaine across the border using low-flying aircraft. The presence of a military helicopter threatened to expose their entire network and cost them millions of dollars. The cartel commander, a former military pilot himself, made a fateful decision. Rather than abort their operation and lose the substantial investment, he ordered his pilots to intercept and eliminate the Apache helicopter. What he didn't know was that he had just declared war on one of the most skilled combat pilots in the United States military. The commander believed his superior numbers and element of surprise would guarantee victory against a single helicopter crew conducting a routine patrol. Within minutes, 3 modified jets took off from a hidden airstrip carved into the desert landscape. These aircraft, originally civilian planes that had been extensively modified with weapon systems and armor plating, represented the cartel's air force. Each plane carried heat-seeking missiles and machine guns, piloted by experienced mercenaries who had been recruited from various military backgrounds around the world. Sarah first noticed something unusual when her Apache's threat detection system began picking up multiple aircraft signatures approaching from the south. The contacts were flying low and fast, using terrain masking to avoid detection by other military radar systems. Initially, she assumed they might be Border Patrol aircraft or perhaps other military units conducting exercises in the area. Lieutenant Thompson, monitoring the radar display, frowned as he studied the approaching contacts. Something about their flight pattern didn't seem right. The aircraft were maintaining radio silence and approaching in an attack formation that suggested hostile intent. His years of training kicked in as he began preparing the Apache's defensive systems while alerting Sarah to the potential threat. As the distance between the aircraft closed rapidly, Sarah's combat instincts took over. She immediately contacted base operations to report the unidentified aircraft and request backup, but the remote location meant help was at least 20 minutes away. The situation was about to transform from a routine patrol into a life-or-death aerial combat scenario that would test every skill Sarah had learned during her military career. The first indication that Sarah was facing a real threat came when her Apache's missile warning system suddenly erupted in urgent beeps and flashing red lights. A heat-seeking missile had been launched from one of the approaching aircraft, streaking through the morning sky directly toward her helicopter. Years of combat training took over instantly as Sarah threw the Apache into a sharp diving turn, dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming missile's guidance system. The missile, designed for slower-moving targets, lost its lock and exploded harmlessly in a brilliant flash several hundred meters away. However, Sarah realized with cold certainty that she was facing a coordinated attack by multiple hostile aircraft. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a training exercise gone wrong. Someone had deliberately targeted her Apache helicopter with deadly force, and she needed to respond accordingly. Lieutenant Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom as he rapidly activated the helicopter's weapon systems. The Apache's nose-mounted 30mm chain gun swiveled as he acquired targeting data on the nearest hostile aircraft. Simultaneously, he armed the Hellfire missiles mounted on the helicopter's stub wings, preparing for what appeared to be an inevitable aerial combat engagement against overwhelming odds. The three cartel jets had spread out in a classic attack formation, attempting to surround the Apache and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Their pilots, confident in their numerical advantage, believed they could quickly overwhelm the single military helicopter. However, they had seriously underestimated both the combat capabilities of the AH-64 Apache and the skill of its crew. Sarah's years of intensive flight training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario. She knew that the Apache's superior maneuverability and advanced weapon systems could potentially offset the numerical disadvantage, but only if she could prevent the enemy aircraft from coordinating their attacks effectively. Her strategy became clear: divide and conquer, using the helicopter's agility to engage each aircraft individually rather than facing all three simultaneously. Banking sharply to the right, Sarah dove toward the rocky terrain below, using the desert landscape to break the visual contact between her Apache and the attacking jets. The enemy pilots, flying faster aircraft designed for higher altitude operations, found it difficult to maintain visual contact with the low-flying helicopter as it maneuvered through the maze of canyons and ridges. As the first jet attempted to follow Sarah into the canyon system, Lieutenant Thompson achieved a perfect targeting solution with the chain gun. The 30mm rounds, fired at a rate of 625 rounds per minute, created a devastating stream of projectiles that struck the aircraft's engine compartment. The jet, already struggling to maintain control at low altitude, suffered catastrophic engine failure and began trailing thick black smoke. The cartel pilot, realizing his aircraft was doomed, attempted to climb away from the canyon floor to gain altitude for an emergency ejection. However, the damaged engine finally failed completely, and the jet crashed into the desert floor in a spectacular explosion that sent a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris high into the morning sky. Sarah felt no satisfaction at the destruction of the first enemy aircraft. Her military training had taught her that aerial combat was about survival, not glory. Two hostile jets remained airborne, and their pilots would now be even more determined to avenge their fallen comrade. The element of surprise was gone, and the remaining enemy pilots would be more cautious in their approach. The second cartel jet approached from a different angle, trying to catch the Apache as it emerged from the canyon system. This pilot had learned from his comrade's fatal mistake and maintained higher altitude while launching another heat-seeking missile at the military helicopter. Sarah's threat warning system activated again, but this time she was ready with a different defensive strategy. Instead of diving away from the missile, Sarah pulled the Apache into a steep climb while simultaneously releasing a pattern of flares, designed to create multiple heat signatures. The missile, confused by the decoy flares, locked onto the wrong target and exploded against a rocky cliff face. However, the climbing maneuver had exposed the Apache to attack from the third aircraft, which had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Machine gun fire from the third jet stitched across the desert floor just meters below the Apache's landing gear. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of bullets passing close to her aircraft, and she knew that her luck couldn't hold indefinitely. The enemy pilots were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to counter her defensive maneuvers. The battle had been raging for nearly 10 minutes when Sarah found herself in the most dangerous position of her military career. The two remaining cartel jets had managed to coordinate their attacks more effectively, forcing her Apache into a deadly crossfire situation. One aircraft attacked from the east while the other approached from the west, leaving her with limited escape routes through the narrow canyon system. Lieutenant Thompson had expended most of their ammunition engaging. The enemy aircraft and their fuel reserves were beginning to run dangerously low due to the intense maneuvering required for survival. The Apache's engines were operating at maximum power settings, consuming fuel at an alarming rate while generating the energy needed for Sarah's aggressive defensive flying. As the eastern aircraft launched another missile, Sarah realized she was facing a potentially fatal situation. The canyon walls on both sides limited her maneuvering options, and the second jet was positioning itself to attack from her blind spot. For the first time since the engagement began, doubt crept into her mind. The odds were overwhelming, and even her exceptional skills might not be enough to survive much longer. Then something unexpected happened that would later become the stuff of military legend. As Sarah pulled the Apache into what she believed might be her final evasive maneuver, she caught sight of something that struck her as absolutely absurd. The pilot of the nearest cartel jet had painted a ridiculous cartoon character on the nose of his aircraft, complete with exaggerated features and bright colors that seemed completely out of place in a deadly aerial combat situation. The incongruity of the situation suddenly hit her with full force. Here she was, engaged in a life-or-death battle with drug smugglers who had decorated their weapons of war like children's toys. The absurdity was so overwhelming that despite the mortal danger she faced, Sarah began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle but quickly grew into full-throated laughter that echoed through her helmet microphone. Lieutenant Thompson, hearing his pilot's laughter in the middle of their desperate fight for survival, initially thought the stress of combat had affected Sarah's mental state. However, something about her laughter seemed to have an unexpected effect on their situation. Her flying, instead of becoming erratic, actually became more precise and confident than ever before. The laughter seemed to release all the tension and fear that had been building up during the engagement. Sarah's mind became crystal clear, her reflexes sharper, and her tactical thinking more innovative than at any point in her military career. She realized that fear had been limiting her options, making her think defensively rather than taking the initiative against her attackers. With renewed confidence, Sarah executed a maneuver that violated every conventional rule of helicopter combat tactics. Instead of continuing to evade the attacking jets, she turned directly toward the nearest aircraft and accelerated at maximum speed. The cartel pilot, expecting the Apache to continue running away, was completely unprepared for this aggressive counterattack. The unexpected maneuver brought the Apache within range of its remaining Hellfire missiles, and Lieutenant Thompson achieved a perfect lock on the enemy aircraft. The laser-guided missile streaked across the desert sky and struck the jet's fuel tank, causing a massive explosion that lit up the morning sky. The aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, sending burning debris raining down across several square miles of desert terrain. The pilot of the final remaining cartel jet, witnessing the destruction of his two companions, suddenly found himself alone against an Apache helicopter crew that had demonstrated remarkable combat effectiveness. His confidence, which had been high at the beginning of the engagement when he enjoyed a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, evaporated completely as he realized he was now facing skilled military opponents who had already proven their deadly capabilities. Sarah's laughter continued to echo through the radio frequencies, picked up by her open microphone and transmitted to anyone monitoring the military communication channels. The sound was so infectious and filled with such genuine mirth that it seemed to demoralize the remaining enemy pilot even further. How could anyone laugh while engaged in deadly aerial combat unless they were completely confident in their ability to win? The psychological effect of Sarah's laughter on the final cartel pilot cannot be underestimated. Military psychologists would later study recordings of this engagement and note how the unexpected sound of laughter in a combat situation can completely disrupt an enemy's mental state and decision-making processes. The pilot had been prepared for fear, anger, or professional military communications, but laughter was something entirely outside his experience. The final cartel pilot made a critical error that would seal his fate. Rattled by Sarah's infectious laughter, and the destruction of his two wingmen, he abandoned his careful tactical approach and decided to make a desperate head-on attack against the Apache helicopter. His plan was simple but flawed. Use his aircraft's superior speed to close the distance quickly and overwhelm the helicopter with machine gun fire before Sarah could react. However, Sarah's years of combat training had prepared her for exactly this type of attack. As soon as she saw the enemy jet turn toward her position and accelerate to attack speed, she knew what the pilot intended to do. Her laughter grew even louder as she realized the enemy had just made the tactical mistake that would end the engagement in her favor. Instead of turning away from the attacking aircraft, Sarah maintained her heading and altitude, creating what appeared to be a perfect head-on collision course. To any observer, it would have seemed like a deadly game of aerial chicken, with both aircraft racing toward each other at combined speeds of over 400 miles per hour. The collision would be catastrophic for both crews, but Sarah had no intention of actually colliding with the enemy aircraft. Lieutenant Thompson, understanding his pilot's strategy through years of flying together, prepared the Apache's remaining weapons systems for a single decisive engagement. They had one Hellfire missile left, along with a few dozen rounds for the chain gun. This would be their final opportunity to end the threat posed by the cartel aircraft, and there would be no second chances if they missed. The distance between the two aircraft closed rapidly, as both pilots maintained their collision course. The cartel pilot, expecting the Apache to break away at the last moment, held his fire until he could achieve a certain kill with his machine guns. His confidence was returning as he realized the helicopter had nowhere to run in the flat desert terrain ahead. At precisely the right moment, when the aircraft were less than 1,000 meters apart, Sarah executed a maneuver that showcased the Apache helicopter's unique capabilities. She pulled the aircraft into a vertical climb, while simultaneously rotating the helicopter around its main rotor axis, creating a corkscrew motion that confused the enemy pilot's targeting systems. The cartel jet, designed for high-speed flight in relatively straight lines, could not match the Apache's incredible maneuverability. As the pilot attempted to adjust his aim to compensate for Sarah's evasive action, he made the fatal mistake of reducing his airspeed too much while pulling into a steep climb. His aircraft, already operating near its performance limits at low altitude, began to stall. Lieutenant Thompson seized this perfect opportunity and fired their last Hellfire missile at point-blank range. The laser-guided weapon tracked its target flawlessly, striking the stalling aircraft in the center of its fuselage. The explosion was so close to the Apache that Sarah felt the shockwave buffet her helicopter, but the Apache's rugged construction absorbed the impact without sustaining serious damage. The destruction of the third and final cartel aircraft was spectacular. The jet broke apart in midair, with pieces of burning wreckage scattered across several miles of desert landscape. The threat to Sarah and Lieutenant Thompson was finally eliminated, but the engagement had pushed both the Apache and its crew to their absolute limits. As the debris from the final enemy aircraft rained down around them, Sarah's laughter finally began to subside. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the intense combat engagement was starting to fade, replaced by the professional satisfaction of a mission successfully completed against overwhelming odds. However, she knew that their situation remained precarious due to their critically low fuel reserves. The Apache's fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels, barely enough to return to base if they flew in a straight line at optimal efficiency settings. Any further combat maneuvering or delays could result in the helicopter running out of fuel before reaching safety. Sarah immediately contacted base operations to report their situation and request emergency landing clearance. The radio response from Fort Huachuca was a mixture of relief and amazement. The base operations center had been monitoring the engagement through radar and radio communications, watching helplessly as a single Apache helicopter faced off against 3 hostile aircraft. When Sarah's final transmission confirmed that all enemy aircraft had been destroyed and her crew was safe, spontaneous cheering erupted in the operations center. However, the celebration was premature. Unknown to Sarah and her crew, the destruction of the cartel's aircraft had triggered a chain of events that would soon present them with an even greater challenge. The drug lords, having invested millions of dollars in their air fleet, were not prepared to simply accept the loss of their aircraft and crews without seeking revenge against the military helicopter that had destroyed their operation. As Sarah carefully managed the Apache's fuel consumption during their return flight to Fort Huachuca, she had no idea that her laughter during the aerial combat had been recorded and transmitted across multiple radio frequencies. The engagement had lasted long enough for various military installations, border patrol stations, and even civilian air traffic controllers to pick up fragments of the radio transmissions. The sound of Sarah's infectious laughter echoing through the radio waves, while engaged in deadly aerial combat, created an immediate legend among military personnel throughout the region. Within hours of the engagement, audio recordings were being shared through unofficial channels, and Sarah's call sign, Viper, became associated with the most extraordinary display of combat confidence anyone had witnessed. However, the immediate concern was getting the damaged Apache safely back to base. The helicopter had sustained several bullet holes from the machine gun attacks, and while none had struck critical systems, the aircraft was bleeding hydraulic fluid at an alarming rate. Sarah's flying skills were being tested once again as she compensated for the gradually degrading flight controls. Lieutenant Thompson monitored their fuel consumption with growing concern. The mathematical calculations were unforgiving. They had barely enough fuel to reach Fort Huachuca if everything went perfectly. Any headwinds, navigation errors, or mechanical problems would force them to attempt an emergency landing in the hostile desert terrain, where cartel ground forces might still be operating. Meanwhile, at the hidden cartel compound, the destruction of their air fleet had triggered a massive response. The drug lords had invested over $50 million in their military-style operation, and the loss of 3 aircraft and experienced pilots represented a financial catastrophe that threatened their entire organization. More importantly, the successful military interdiction of their operation meant that law enforcement agencies now knew the location of their supposedly secret facilities. The cartel commander, the same former military pilot who had ordered the attack on Sarah's Apache, was facing a crisis that could destroy his criminal empire. His superiors in the drug trafficking hierarchy were demanding explanations and threatening his life if he couldn't recover their massive investment. In his desperation, he made another fateful decision that would escalate the conflict far beyond a simple aerial engagement. Rather than cutting his losses and abandoning the compromised operation, the commander ordered his remaining forces to launch a ground-based attack on Fort Huachuca itself. His plan was audacious and incredibly dangerous. Use surface-to-air missiles to bring down military aircraft, then launch coordinated ground attacks on the base to recover his organization's losses through captured military equipment and hostages. The cartel possessed sophisticated weaponry that rivaled many national armies. Years of drug profits had allowed them to purchase military-grade equipment from corrupt officials and arms dealers around the world. Their arsenal included shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, armored vehicles, and enough firepower to pose a serious threat to a military installation. As Sarah's Apache approached Fort Huachuca, with fuel gauges reading dangerously low, the base's radar operators detected multiple ground-based radar signatures moving toward their position. The cartel's mobile missile launchers had left their hidden positions and were deploying around the base perimeter, preparing for what appeared to be a coordinated attack on the military facility. The base commander immediately declared a security alert and began implementing defensive measures. However, Fort Huachuca was primarily a training facility, not a frontline combat base. Most of their aircraft were training helicopters and transport planes, not heavily armed combat aircraft capable of responding to a ground-based missile threat. Sarah received an urgent radio transmission from base operations as she approached the landing pattern. The message was brief but chilling. Hostile ground forces with surface-to-air missiles were positioning around the base, and her Apache might be flying into a deadly trap. The fuel situation gave her no choice but to continue the approach, but landing safely would require navigating through a potential gauntlet of enemy missile fire. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. Having survived an aerial engagement against overwhelming odds, she now faced an even more dangerous threat just as she was trying to return to safety. The enemy had learned from their previous mistakes and was now attempting to use weapons specifically designed to destroy aircraft like her Apache helicopter. As she began her final approach to Fort Huachuca, Sarah's throat microphone picked up something unexpected. Despite the mortal danger she faced, despite the exhaustion from the previous combat engagement, despite the stress of flying a damaged aircraft with critically low fuel reserves, she began to laugh again. The sound was quieter than before, almost contemplative, but it carried the same infectious quality that had demoralized the cartel pilots during the aerial engagement. Lieutenant Thompson, hearing his pilot's laughter for the second time that day, realized that Sarah had entered a mental state that few combat veterans ever experience. She had transcended fear and was operating on a level of tactical awareness and confidence that bordered on the supernatural. Whatever challenges awaited them in the next few minutes, Thompson knew they would face them with the most skilled and determined pilot he had ever flown with. The final phase of Sarah's extraordinary day began as her Apache helicopter approached Fort Huachuca, with fuel gauges showing virtually empty tanks. The base's defensive systems had detected at least 6 mobile missile launchers positioned in a rough circle around the installation, creating a deadly gauntlet that any approaching aircraft would have to navigate. Sarah's quiet laughter continued to echo through the radio frequencies as she assessed the tactical situation with remarkable calm. Instead of approaching the base along the standard flight path, which would expose her helicopter to multiple missile launches simultaneously, she decided to implement a strategy that would once again violate conventional military doctrine. Rather than flying high to avoid ground-based threats, Sarah dropped the Apache to extremely low altitude, using the base's own buildings and structures as cover from the missile launchers. This approach required incredible precision flying, as any mistake would result in a catastrophic collision with ground obstacles, but it offered the best chance of reaching the landing pad safely. The cartel forces, positioned around the base perimeter, had been expecting a conventional approach and were caught off guard by Sarah's unconventional tactics. Their missile systems were designed to engage aircraft flying at normal altitudes and approach angles, not helicopters maneuvering between buildings at ground level. As Sarah threaded the Apache through the maze of base structures, her laughter grew slightly louder, transmitted clearly through the communication systems to every person monitoring the military frequencies. Ground personnel at Fort Huachuca, who had been taking cover from the expected missile attacks, began emerging from bunkers and shelters to witness the most extraordinary display of helicopter flying any of them had ever seen. The first missile launch came from the eastern perimeter as Sarah's Apache emerged briefly into open airspace between 2 hangar buildings. The surface-to-air missile streaked toward her helicopter, but Sarah's anticipation of the attack allowed her to duck behind another building just as the weapon passed harmlessly overhead. The missile, unable to adjust its flight path quickly enough, struck a radio tower and exploded in a brilliant flash. Lieutenant Thompson had been monitoring the base's communication frequencies and heard something that gave him hope. Military reinforcements were finally arriving in response to the base commander's emergency calls for assistance. F-16 fighter jets from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base were inbound, along with additional Apache helicopters from other Army installations in the region. However, Sarah knew that help would arrive too late to assist with her immediate landing. The Apache's fuel was so critically low that the engines could fail at any moment, forcing an emergency auto-rotation landing that would be extremely dangerous in the current tactical situation. She had to reach the safety of the base landing pad within the next few minutes, regardless of the missile threat. The second missile launch came from directly ahead as Sarah approached the main landing area. This time there was no building to hide behind, and the missile was tracking her helicopter with deadly accuracy. In what would later be analyzed as one of the most brilliant pieces of tactical flying ever recorded, Sarah used the Apache's own rotor wash to her advantage. By suddenly increasing power and creating a massive downdraft, Sarah generated a dust cloud so thick that it obscured her helicopter's heat signature from the missile's guidance system. The weapon, confused by the thermal interference, lost its lock and exploded harmlessly in the dust cloud. However, the power increase had consumed the last of their usable fuel, and the Apache's engines began showing signs of imminent failure. As Sarah's helicopter finally touched down on the Fort Huachuca landing pad, her laughter reached its crescendo echoing across the base's communication systems and being heard by hundreds of military personnel. The sound was so filled with triumph and joy that it seemed to energize everyone who heard it, transforming fear and tension into celebration and amazement. The arriving F-16 fighter jets made quick work of the remaining cartel forces. The surface-to-air, missile launchers exposed in their fixed positions around the base perimeter were destroyed by precision airstrikes within minutes of the fighters' arrival. The cartel's ground forces, already demoralized by their failure to stop a single Apache helicopter, surrendered or fled when faced with overwhelming air power. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's actions during the engagement became the subject of intense study by military tacticians and combat psychologists. The audio recordings of her laughter during the aerial battle were analyzed to understand how psychological factors can influence combat effectiveness. Her unconventional tactics were incorporated into new training programs for helicopter pilots, facing multiple aircraft threats. The cartel organization responsible for the attack was completely dismantled within months. The loss of their air fleet and the exposure of their operations led to arrests throughout their network, effectively ending one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking operations ever encountered by law enforcement agencies. Sarah Martinez was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions during the engagement, but she always insisted that her success was due to her training and the exceptional capabilities of her crew and aircraft. However, military historians noted that her ability to maintain not just composure but actual joy during life-threatening combat represented something unprecedented in the annals of aerial warfare. Years later, when asked about the laughter that had become legendary throughout military circles, Sarah would smile and explain that sometimes the only appropriate response to an impossible situation is to find the humor in it. Her laughter hadn't just been a psychological weapon against her enemies. It had been a reminder that even in the darkest moments the human spirit could find reasons for joy and triumph.